I still remember that summer, the one that seemed so full of promise and adventure. We were young and eager, always chasing the next thrill. When we stumbled upon the old asylum on the edge of town, it seemed like the perfect place for a night of excitement and exploration. Little did we know, it would become the setting for our worst nightmare. There were 6 of us: me, Jake, Sarah, Amy, Tom, and Lucy. We had heard the stories, of course. Everyone in town had. The asylum had been abandoned for decades, left to rot after a fire in the late 70s. People whispered about the screams that could be heard at night, the souls of patients who had perished in the blaze, their spirits never finding peace. It was just a local legend, we thought. We were too old to be scared by ghost stories. The night we chose was warm, the air thick with humidity. Armed with flashlights, we made our way through the overgrown path that led to the asylum's entrance. The building loomed ahead of us, a hulking shadow against the night sky. Its windows were shattered, its doors hanging off their hinges. A shiver of excitement and fear ran down my spine as we stepped inside. The interior was worse than I had imagined. Graffiti covered the walls, and the floor was littered with debris. The air was musty, and the silence was oppressive. We wandered through the first few rooms, our flashlights cutting through the darkness. It was eerily quiet, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. "Let's split up," Jake suggested. "We'll cover more ground that way." I hesitated, but the others agreed. Sarah and I paired up, while the rest of the group fanned out. We moved through the halls, our footsteps echoing on the tile floors. The asylum seemed endless, a maze of corridors and rooms that all looked the same. Every now and then, we'd hear a distant sound, a creak, a thud, but we brushed it off as the building settling. We had been exploring for about an hour when we heard the first scream. It was distant, echoing through the halls. Sarah and I froze, our hearts pounding in our chests. The scream was high-pitched, filled with pain and terror. It sounded like a woman. "Did you hear that?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. I nodded, my mouth dry. "Yeah, let's find the others." We hurried back the way we had come, calling out for our friends. Our voices echoed back at us, but there was no response. The scream came again, louder this time, and closer. It seemed to be coming from the direction we were heading. We turned a corner and nearly collided with Tom and Amy. "Did you guys hear that?" Tom asked, his face pale. "Yeah," I said. "Where's Jake and Lucy?" "We haven't seen them," Amy said, her voice shaking. "We need to find them and get out of here." We moved as a group now, our fear growing with each step. The asylum seemed to be playing tricks on us, the halls twisting and turning in ways that didn't make sense. The screams continued, sometimes close, sometimes far, but always echoing through the building. It was as if the walls themselves were alive, amplifying the sound and throwing it back at us. Finally, we found Jake. He was in one of the larger rooms, standing still and staring at something on the floor. As we approached, we saw what had him transfixed. It was Lucy. Her body twisted and broken, her eyes wide with terror. A scream built in my throat, but I choked it back, my mind struggling to comprehend what I was seeing. "We need to leave," Tom said, his voice barely a whisper. We turned to go, but the door slammed shut in front of us. The temperature dropped suddenly, and our breath came out in white puffs. The screams started again, louder and more insistent. They were all around us now, echoing off the walls, filling our heads with their torment. "What's happening?" Amy cried, her eyes wide with panic. "I don't know," Jake said, his voice shaking. "But we need to get out of here. Now. We tried to retrace our steps, but the asylum seemed to be shifting around us. Every turn led to a dead end. Every door we tried was locked or led to another part of the building. The screams grew louder, more desperate. I could hear words now, jumbled and frantic, but clear enough to send chills down my spine. Help us. Save us. Why won't you help? They're the patients, Sarah said suddenly, her face pale. The ones who died in the fire. They're trapped here. We can't help them, I said, my voice shaking. We need to get out. We ran through the halls, our flashlights flickering as the batteries began to die. The screams followed us, relentless and unending. I could feel something behind me, a cold presence that seemed to be watching, waiting. Every now and then, I'd catch a glimpse of a figure in the corner of my eye, but when I turned to look, there was nothing there. Finally, we found a staircase that led to the basement. It was our only option. We descended into the darkness, the air growing colder with each step. The basement was a labyrinth of old storage rooms and forgotten equipment. The screams were quieter down here, but no less disturbing. We moved quickly, trying to find a way out. The walls seemed to close in around us, the darkness pressing down. I could hear the others breathing, their fear palpable. We turned a corner and found ourselves in a large, open room. In the center was an old operating table, rusted and covered in stains. Around it were shelves filled with dusty jars and medical instruments. We shouldn't be here, Amy said, her voice trembling. This is where they did the experiments. Experiments? I asked, my stomach turning. Yeah, Jake said. They used to perform all kinds of horrible procedures on the patients, lobotomies, electroshock therapy. Some of them didn't survive. The screams started again, louder and more desperate. The room seemed to close in around us, the walls pulsing with a dark energy. I could feel something moving in the shadows, something watching us. We need to keep moving, I said, my voice shaking. There's got to be another way out. We found a door at the far end of the room and pushed through it. The hallway beyond was narrow and dark, the air thick with decay. We moved quickly, our fear driving us forward. The screams followed us, echoing off the walls, growing louder with each step. We turned a corner and found ourselves in front of a large metal door. It was old and rusted, but it seemed to be our only way out. We pushed it open and stepped into a large open space. The air was colder here, and I could see my breath in front of me. This must be the morgue, Jake said, his voice barely a whisper. The room was filled with metal tables and old rusted gurneys. The walls were lined with drawers, each one labeled with a number. The screams were louder here, almost deafening. I could feel something pressing down on me, a weight that made it hard to breathe. We need to find a way out, I said, my voice shaking. There's got to be an exit somewhere. We moved through the room, our flashlights flickering. The air grew colder, and I could feel something moving in the shadows. I turned to look and saw a figure standing in the corner. It was a woman, her face twisted in pain and terror. Her eyes met mine, and I felt a surge of fear. Help us, she whispered, her voice barely audible over the screams. I turned to run, but the door slammed shut behind us. The room seemed to close in, the walls pulsing with a dark energy. The screams grew louder, more desperate. I could feel something pressing down on me, a weight that made it hard to breathe. We need to get out, I said, my voice shaking. Now. We pushed through another door and found ourselves in a narrow hallway. The air was thick with decay, and the screams followed us, relentless and unending. We ran, our fear driving us forward. The The hallway seemed to stretch on forever, the walls closing in around us. Finally, we saw a light ahead. It was a small, flickering bulb, but it was enough to give us hope. We pushed forward, our breath coming in ragged gasps. The light grew brighter, and we found ourselves in front of another door. We pushed it open and stepped outside. The night air was cold and crisp, a stark contrast to the stifling atmosphere inside the asylum. We stood there, panting, our hearts racing. The screams were gone, replaced by the sounds of the night. I could still feel the weight of the asylum pressing down on me, but I was free. We never spoke about what happened that night. The memories were too painful, too terrifying. But sometimes, late at night, I can still hear the screams. They echo in my mind, a reminder of the horrors we faced. And I know that the souls of the asylum's patients are still there, trapped in the darkness, their cries for help unanswered. It started innocuously enough, a single restless night, the kind where sleep feels just out of reach, like a word on the tip of your tongue. But it was that first night when I felt the chill. I dismissed it as a draft from the old house's rattling windows. My parents had gotten a good deal on the place, probably because no one else wanted a creaky, century-old Victorian on the edge of town. The first time it happened, I didn't even realize it. I woke up in the middle of the night, unable to move. My room was bathed in pale moonlight, and everything seemed normal, except for the weight pressing down on my chest. I tried to scream, but my mouth wouldn't open. Panic surged through me, and I lay there, paralyzed, until sleep mercifully claimed me again. The next morning, I shrugged it off as a bad dream. I didn't tell my parents. They already had enough on their plate with the move and their new jobs. But the second night, the paralysis returned. This time, I saw something. A shadow, standing at the foot of my bed. I couldn't make out any features, just a dark silhouette against the dim light. My heart pounded in my chest, and I struggled to move, to cry out. But it was as if I were frozen in ice. The shadow didn't move, didn't speak. It simply stood there, watching. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, I was free. I bolted upright, gasping for air, the shadow gone. My room looked just as it had before, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Sleep was elusive after that. I dreaded the nights, spending hours tossing and turning, only to succumb to an uneasy rest filled with nightmares of dark figures and silent watchers. As the days passed, I became a shadow of myself. My friends noticed the dark circles under my eyes. My teachers commented on my lack of focus. I couldn't bring myself to tell anyone what was happening. Who would believe me? I wasn't even sure I believed it myself. Then, one night, the shadow moved. It was the third week after the dreams began. I woke to find myself paralyzed, the shadow at the foot of my bed. But this time, it took a step forward. My breath caught in my throat as it moved closer, its form growing larger, more defined. I could almost make out a face, but it was blurred, indistinct, like a smudged painting. The room grew colder with each step it took, and I felt a suffocating pressure around me, as if the very air was being squeezed from my lungs. Desperation surged through me. I had to move, had to do something. With every ounce of willpower, I managed to wrench my hand free from the invisible bonds. It was enough to break the spell. I shot up, flipping on the bedside lamp. The shadow vanished instantly, leaving me gasping in the sudden brightness. I couldn't keep this to myself any longer. The next morning, I told my parents. They exchanged worried glances, but their reassurances felt hollow. My mom suggested it was just stress from the move, while my dad mentioned seeing a doctor, but I knew this was something more. That evening, I researched sleep paralysis, hoping to find some logical explanation. The stories I read were eerily similar to mine. People waking up unable to move, seeing shadowy figures. But none of the accounts mentioned the figures getting closer each night. Desperate for answers, I turned to the history of our house. I spent hours in the local library, combing through old newspapers and records. It was there, in the dusty archives, that I found it. An article from 1957 detailed the death of a man named Harold Granger, who had lived in our house. He was found dead in his bedroom, under mysterious circumstances. The article mentioned rumors of Granger being obsessed with the occult, that he dabbled in dark rituals. I felt a chill run down my spine as I read further. The circumstances of his death were never fully explained. Some said it was a heart attack. Others whispered about a curse. But the most unsettling part was a quote from a neighbor, claiming that in the weeks leading up to his death, Granger had confided in him about seeing a shadowy figure standing at the foot of his bed. I left the library with a knot in my stomach. The pieces were falling into place, but I had no idea how to stop it. That night, I lay in bed, every muscle tense, waiting for the inevitable. It wasn't long before I felt the familiar heaviness, the paralysis setting in. The shadow was there, closer than ever. I could see its eyes now, dark pits that seemed to suck in the light. I struggled to move, to break free, but it was no use. The shadow leaned in, and I felt its cold breath on my face. Panic surged through me, and I did the only thing I could think of. I started to speak, or at least tried to. My lips barely moved, but I forced out the words. "Leave me alone." To my surprise, the shadow recoiled. It didn't vanish, but it stopped advancing. I kept repeating the words, louder and more forcefully. "Leave me alone! Leave this house!" The shadow seemed to waver, as if caught between two worlds. And then, it was gone. The room felt warmer. The oppressive weight lifted. I could move again. I sat up, trembling, but relieved. The following nights were peaceful. The shadow didn't return, and I started to feel like myself again. I told my parents about the history of the house, and they agreed it was time to move. We left that old Victorian behind, and I hoped we left the spirit of Harold Granger with it. Years later, I still think about those nights. I wonder if someone else has moved in, if they're seeing the shadow at the foot of their bed. I wonder if they'll be able to make it go away. But most of all, I wonder if it's truly gone, or just waiting for the next restless dreamer to claim. It all started on a crisp autumn afternoon when my family decided to clear out the old attic. My wife, Emma, our teenage son Alex, and I had recently moved into this century-old Victorian house, lured by its charm and history. Little did we know it held secrets that would soon unravel our sanity. The attic was a dusty labyrinth of forgotten relics and cobweb-covered memories. As we sifted through boxes of old clothes, tarnished silverware, and yellowed letters, Emma discovered an antique photograph album. Its leather cover was worn, and the clasp was rusted shut. Intrigued by the mystery it promised, we gathered around a small table and pried it open. Inside, the album was filled with black and white photographs, each meticulously dated and labeled. The first few pages showed the original owners of the house, the Whitley family, in various poses and settings. There were cheerful scenes of picnics, formal gatherings, and candid shots of children playing in the garden. But as we flipped through the album, the photographs became progressively darker, capturing unsettling and eerie images. That night, as we sat in the living room, the album lay open on the coffee table. Alex was particularly fascinated by it, his teenage curiosity piqued by the aura of mystery surrounding the photos. We decided to leave the album downstairs and headed to bed, unaware of the terror that awaited us. In the dead of night, I was jolted awake by a strange sound. It was a faint, rustling noise, like the pages of a book being turned. I nudged Emma, who groggily acknowledged the sound, but we dismissed it as the wind, or an old house's creaks and groans. We drifted back to sleep, unaware of the sinister presence lurking in our home. The next morning, over breakfast, Alex mentioned something strange. He claimed a new photograph had appeared in the album overnight. Curious and slightly skeptical, we followed him to the living room. To our astonishment, there it was, a new photograph, slightly blurred and ghostly. It depicted the hallway outside our bedrooms, a shadowy figure barely visible at the far end. Emma and I exchanged uneasy glances. Perhaps it was a prank by Alex, or maybe we had overlooked it the previous night. We decided to monitor the album more closely and went about our day, trying to shake off the growing sense of dread. That night, sleep did not come easily. Every creak of the house seemed amplified, and the darkness felt oppressively thick. Again, I heard the rustling noise, louder this time. I crept downstairs, flashlight in hand, and approached the album with trepidation. Another new photograph had appeared, this one clearer than the last. The shadowy figure was now halfway down the hallway, its features still indistinct but undeniably human. Fear tightened its grip on my heart. I woke Emma and Alex, showing them the new photograph. Alex swore he had nothing to do with it, his pale face and wide eyes a testament to his sincerity. We decided to lock the album away in a cabinet, hoping to put an end to the unsettling occurrences. But the photographs continued to appear, each night bringing the shadowy figure closer. Our once peaceful home now felt like a trap, the walls closing in on us as the presence drew nearer. Emma suggested we contact a paranormal investigator, but I was skeptical. It seemed like a step too far into the irrational, yet the evidence was undeniable. On the 7th night, the photograph showed the figure standing at our bedroom door. Its features were still blurred, but the malevolent intent was palpable. We barely slept, our nerves frayed, and senses on high alert. The house was filled with an oppressive silence, broken only by the occasional rustling of the album's pages. Desperation drove us to action. The next morning, we called in a local historian who specialized in the paranormal. Mr. Collins was a frail, elderly man with a wealth of knowledge about the house and its dark history. He listened intently as we recounted our experiences, his expression growing graver by the minute. "The Whitley family," he began, "met a tragic end. Legend has it that the father, Henry Whitley, dabbled in dark arts, trying to communicate with the dead. One night, something went horribly wrong. The entire family was found dead, their faces frozen in terror. Since then, strange occurrences have plagued this house." Mr. Collins examined the album, his fingers trembling slightly as he turned the pages. "This album," he said, "is a conduit. The photographs are a manifestation of the spirit's growing power. It is trying to escape its confines and enter our world." The gravity of his words sank in, and we realized we were in grave danger. Mr. Collins advised us to leave the house immediately, but we were determined to confront the entity. That night, we gathered in the living room, armed with courage and a few protective charms Mr. Collins had provided. Midnight approached, and the air grew colder. The rustling began again, louder and more insistent. The album lay on the table, its pages flipping on their own. We watched in horror as a new photograph appeared, showing the figure standing at the foot of our bed. The room plunged into darkness, and an icy wind swept through, extinguishing our candles. The figure materialized before us, no longer confined to the photographs. It was Henry Whitley, his eyes hollow, and his face twisted in malevolent glee. "You should not have disturbed my rest." His voice echoed through the room, cold and hollow. "Now, you will join me." A force seized us, paralyzing our limbs and stifling our screams. The last thing I saw was Henry's ghastly form reaching out, his icy fingers closing around my throat. When I woke, the sun was shining, and the house was eerily quiet. Emma and Alex were beside me, their faces etched with terror. The album was gone, and so was Henry Whitley. We had survived the night, but the experience had left us forever changed. We moved out the next day, leaving the house and its dark history behind. But the memory of those photographs and the malevolent spirit that haunted us remained. A chilling reminder of the darkness that can lurk within even the most innocent-seeming places.